Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom can remain free because of generous donors like you. If you'd like to donate, feel free to do so online, or you can send payments through Facebook Messenger. Don't forget to tell your friends about it so that they can enjoy this ministry as well. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any podcasts.
You can listen to my daddy every single day, like in the gym, in the car, or just at home. Glimpse of the Kingdom is awesome!
What I want to do tonight, and we have plenty of time, we'll probably done a little, even done early, is I want to start up saying if there's any questions about anything. Are there any questions, comments about anything we've done?
Yeah, okay. You talking about the corroboration of names, occasions, practices, doctrines, etc., recorded in gospel accounts, which are also recorded in other outside works, showing that the gospel accounts are accurate. So there's many supportive evidences of corroboration with those. And then talked about the other apocryphal writings as well, like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and such, having errors in those ones, and shared one or two errors or areas of lack of corroboration with those. And so I was wondering, are there areas in which the gospel accounts get it wrong based on other sources, focused on the positive aspect of corroboration with the gospel accounts? Are there negative aspects of lack of corroboration or getting it wrong based on other sources, so to also discuss? And likewise, we talked about the lack of corroboration with the apocryphal works, but are there other areas in which those works that are corroborated in other sources, and to what extent? So looking sort of at the
flip side. Good, yeah, that's a good question. Now, I'm sure there were detailed studies on that exact issue, but from off the fly, to start on the second part, if you recall, when we talk about corroborating from the apocryphal gospels, remember those apocryphal gospels are gospels, so-called gospels, written after the New Testament era, like late 1st, early 2nd century, 100, 150, 200 years after our gospels are written. Most scholars think that. Some think they're early, most do not. We call them apocryphal because that word doesn't really matter why, but it's called, that means, hello, what's up? It means hidden. These are gospels that certain groups of Christians used, but the mainstream did not. And so they were very popular in small pockets of so-called groups of Christians, depending which region of the empire they're in. And one of the ways, usually the ways we know about these so-called apocryphal gospels, is because Christian authors wrote against them. And that's kind of a bummer because we wish we had more from people who read from them. Because in some of these apocryphal gospels, we only have fragments. I mean, it's just a story to me. I would love to have just everything ever written ever. But a lot of things we only know about because people like Eusebius or Hegesippus, there's two different Christian authors. Christian historians might say, and this heresy, this gospel they had, and that's the only reference to that so-called gospel anywhere. We don't know what it meant and what it said. So there's numerous of these other writings that were sprouting up all over the place in Egypt and Rome, Roman Empire. The ones for which we have extant, that is, existing manuscripts, things like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and whatnot, we examine them and we can tell that they are almost always derivative. That is, if there's something in them that smacks is corroborated, it comes from the Gospels, or a paraphrase or something of the Gospel. So most scholars say it's not corroboration, independent corroboration. It rather has maintained some tradition they heard from some actual Christian. And then the stuff that's unique, very little of that is corroborated. So they might talk about characters in the story or events in the story for which there's very little or no other corroborating testimony. And I'll come back to the actual gospel, our Gospels, and that's true for ours too, like I said, because it's rare to have certain characters ever mentioned again in history, or certainly dialogue. And that's what the background of apocryphal gospel. Mm-hmm.
Is that apocryphal, all of those, is that what's at the end of the Catholic Bible?
Good question. Are those what's in the end of the Catholic Bible? No, and that's where the tricky part is. That's a good question, and the reason why you tied in there is because it's actually at the end of the Old Testament. The Catholic, so-called Catholic, Roman Catholic canon, Old New Testament, they have books in between the sandwich that Protestants do not have. So that's what's called the Apocrypha. Apocryphal Gospels. There is no New Testament version of that.
Okay. So the apocryphal is different.
It's
Okay.
different, yes, ma'am. And that word makes it kind of tricky. So the Apocrypha is a recognized canon or group of books that Roman Catholics have adopted for many, 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 many years. Protestants did for a while as well, by the way. They just stopped doing it because they didn't read it as much, and it cost money to print it, so they stopped printing it. But Roman Catholics still have them, and Orthodox do as well. The Orthodox Church also has more books in between, and some after the New Testament. Ethiopic Christians have even more after the New Testament and the Old. So the Protestants have the fewest amount of books of all the Christian denominations, divisions, branches. We have the fewest amount at 66. Everybody else has more. No one else has fewer. And most of the more, like I said, comes after the Old Testament, before the New. They might have 6, 7, 9, 10, 11 extra books or fragments of books. And then some have a few after the New Testament that were very popular. Like the Shepherd of Hermas is an apocalyptic work, kind of like Revelation. It's different, though. Shepherd of Hermas, a letter of Barnabas. First Clement was probably the second bishop of Rome after Peter. And you have what other one? Didache. So there's about 5 books, 4 or 5, that were wildly popular in the early church that were read and used in the church for quite some time. And you can read all these. These aren't hidden. We have fairly good manuscript evidence for these documents. I've got English translations right now based on the Greek in my office. You can see them. I'll lend them to you if you want. We have to study all this stuff because that's the earliest formation of Christianity. That's into the 1st century, early 2nd century. Like what happened after the earliest apostles died, then what happened? Those documents give us some indication. The Apocrypha only talks about the meat in between, not meat, but you know what I'm saying. That's all the Apocrypha is, that collection of Roman Catholic text. Roman Catholics, to make it more confusing, they don't call it the Apocrypha. They call that deuterocanonical. The Reformation called it apocryphal somewhat as a slam, a little bit. Luther uses it that way, kind of. But Roman Catholics don't call it the Apocrypha. Protestants call it the Apocrypha. But we're talking about the same collection of books. What's up? Come on in. Sit wherever you want. Past the New Testament, there is nothing like that. We have no collection of books that are canonized and important for any division. So there's no New Testament Apocrypha. There are a bunch of New Testament, post-New Testament documents written, letters, treatises, sermons, so-called Gospels. There's a lot of them, and we study all that as well in PhD. I've got English copies. You can Google a lot of this too. And anyway, there's the tricky part. In my evidence for corroboration, does that help, Anna?
Yes, thanks.
You can read everything I just talked about. I'd be happy to send you works, collections. For example, the New Testament. There's also a whole other collection of documents called the Pseudepigrapha that so-called Christian groups wrote. And there's tons of these books. I mean, there's tons of them because they were prolific authors.
Why don't we include those?
Good. That's a good question. Can I answer that real quick and come back to you? I haven't forgotten your questions. Is this related enough to make it?
Oh, for sure.
Okay. Kristen asked, why don't we put that in our Bible? Great question. Brilliant. To be clear, when I use the word canon, like a cannonball, it's the same word because it comes from the Greek word kanon. And kanon means something like rule or standard or measure. And it can also mean list. And so in the early 2nd, 3rd centuries, when the church talked about the books to be included, they called it in the canon, in the canon, which authoritative list, like a 12-inch ruler. It's the ruler, it's the measure, or it's the official list. So when I say canon, that's what I mean. That collection of books. Can I grab your Bible for a second? So that's all I mean, is the canon is these collections of books, which looks like this is Protestant. I can tell you don't have these. You don't have the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical, which is fine. I'm just saying, here's an example of a typical ESV, yeah. ESV for sure, because they're conservative. So here's a typical Bible. So when someone says, do you believe in the Bible? Technically you say, which one? It's like saying which canon, which book of collections. We have the fewest. Does that make sense so far? So why not include the other text? If you watch the news or any Facebook ads, you'll be told, or talk to atheists or somebody who don't believe it, what they're going to say is, it's because of a deep conspiracy. There are secret books no one wanted you to know about, and it all started with the Pope. The papacy in the 5th, 6th century, they've been squashing off these secret books for years, killing off everybody who sees them. I mean, that kind of stupid, that's what the stuff they say. It makes it the Da Vinci Code, and it keeps propagating online over and over and over. It's false. It's false nonsense. The real answer is, there is no one reason why they excluded those other books. When we read the early church fathers, and they're right in the thick of dealing with what they considered heretical, that is, opposing Christian views. Footnote, Christians seem to have pretty good tolerance for various views within Christianity. And there are certain times people believe things that just seem to go too far. And well, how'd you know it went too far? They believed in something called, I get excited, I'm going to get us bogged down, but you'll probably never hear this the rest of your entire life if I don't talk about this right now. The English translation is the rule of faith. That's the English, and I'll just keep it at that. The rule of faith. This rule of faith is something like a skeleton of oral tradition that says this is what most Christians around the empire believe in. This rule of faith is almost certainly the basis of the later creeds, like the Apostles' Creed and eventually the Nicene Creed. This is the earliest thing. You can read these. I did a whole independent study PhD. You can read the earliest forms of it. So when these early church fathers are struggling, man, I heard this new church popped over in Austin, over in Topeka. Really? Yeah, but they're saying all kinds of stuff. Like what? And they would say, Someone said they have a brand new spirit. The spirit speaking like unlike before. It's revelation time all over again. There was a group like that called the Monetists. And they were wildly charismatic, spirit-driven. The spirit gives new word all the time. It's kind of like the very first form of the ancient charismatic movement, to a degree. And so the other early church fathers around the empire would go, is that right or wrong? Is it in line with the rule of faith or not? And so the earliest church fathers didn't talk much about the canon until there were people arguing that their particular idiosyncratic books should be included in the worship service, alongside Psalms, alongside Deuteronomy, alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They go, hold on now. Gospel of Thomas? What? And does it match this? That was a biggie. So over time, their canon, the list, arose in response to, well, we can't say that. So there was no power. There's different churches all over the empire. There is no Roman Catholic Church yet. I mean, probably Leo is probably considered the first real pope. No, Roman Catholics would say, no, Peter was. But functionally, that's not till 480-ish. I mean, late 400s or late 5th century. So we have hundreds of years where there is no Roman Catholic dominance. There's 3 major centers of power in Christianity. You have Rome up north. You've got what would be called Constantinople eventually. Mm-hmm. So this is the Eastern Greeks. You have the Roman Latin, Eastern Greeks, and you have Antioch, Jerusalem, and then Alexandria, Egypt. So you have, well, I said 3, I meant 5. You have 5 major, if you draw a map of the Mediterranean world, it looks like this. Mm-hmm. And they all have differences and nuances, and I could unpack that for a while. But what they had in common was they all believed basically in the same kind of rule of faith. Now, how do I know that? You can read a lot of their documents, both in Latin and Greek. They shared a lot in common. And so when these books would pop up, say in Egypt, so this is Egypt here, that goes all the way down. That's the Nile, and so this is Egypt basically. Egypt is Roman because it's controlled by the Romans, and Latin speaking. But they have their own little flair. They have an Egyptian/Greek language that you probably heard of called Coptic. It's like a Greek version of Egyptian language. And they produced so-called gospels in the Coptic language. And it seems to be the earliest forms of these gospels are in Coptic, which lets us know they can't be before the gospels themselves, ours, because ours are in Greek. In other words, they had to take a time to get down to Egypt to be written, like the Gospel of Thomas. They seem to be originally written in Coptic. Okay, so the biggest thing up front is, we heard about this new church, they want to start using these new books, can we use them or not? You say, no. So early church fathers talk about this a lot. They talk about it in the churches. And when you read the literature, you realize certain things stand out as the books that should be included. But there's no one person who said, hear you, it's got to be these 5 things or you're out. That's not what happened. There's just too many churches, all spread out in different languages. What happened is these things seem to arise to the top like the cream of the crop kind of thing. One is, does it fit basic orthodoxy as the churches preach it and teach it? And this rule of faith is outlined, I told you, in many, many places. 2, does the book itself, particularly a gospel, does it go back to an apostle? Either firsthand or secondhand. In church tradition, there are 2 gospels that traditionally go back to the firsthand apostle. Do you know what those are? There's only 4, so good, close. John's one of them. And Matthew's the other one. So secondhand would be Mark.
And
In church tradition, Mark translated Peter, and the other is Luke, who was a companion of Paul. And so those are called second. So that was enough to get apostolic, we call it apostolic association. They're associated somehow with an apostle. So if a book was written, they said like Gospel of Thomas, and they go, no, it wasn't. It wasn't associated with Thomas. That's another one. Another thing is, the Gospels themselves, they care very much about being basically within a lifetime of the apostle. That is, it's got to be early or primitive. And when these Gospels arose, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, and say, hey, these are real Gospels from Thomas, whatever, like, no, man. They've been dead for 150 years. No, this is oral tradition that came from, no. And so this lifetime early, and the lifetime of the apostles is a biggie. Another one, very functional, is, are we using it? Is it useful in the church for worship and, of course, and more importantly, discipleship? So it's a very functional criterion, which is, is it really being used? Is it edifying for the body? And these 4 things, there might be a 5th, let me think about it a little bit. These 4 things are by far the most important things. And so what happened is over time, these other Gospels, for these reasons, they didn't meet the criteria.
Does that speak to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit?
Does it speak to the inspiration of the Holy
All of
Spirit?
those things would be during the time when those things were inspired scripture, and after that time, they weren't. Am I reading too much into that?
No, I hear you. Would they say inspiration? Maybe so. Maybe so. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember if they said things like the Gospel of Thomas or whatnot were inspired. And see, the problem was we just lacked too many sources from those who read those other Gospels, what they believed about them. We had more people who opposed them. And I don't know off the top of my head whether or not people like, say, Ignatius said, and we know they're not inspired. They would say something on it. The rule of faith probably goes close to inspiration, probably. But I bet if you asked an ancient church father, they would probably say, yeah, you're right, they're not inspired. They'd probably say that. So that's why we don't use it. Now, hold on now, David. There were some documents, it took a long time. That's true. Some documents that we consider sacred texts now took centuries to be approved by the church. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, Far East, your kinfolk came from, our book called Revelation, Apocalypse of John, it took until the 8th century to be approved in their canon. That's 700 plus years before they said, okay. They preferred a different apocalypse. Apocalypse of Peter. And that was useful in their church for a long time. And their tradition is that it came from Peter himself, and it was early and useful, whatever. The Shepherd of Hermas was used for a long time. The Letter of Barnabas was used for a long time. We have a lot of copies in them, which demonstrates the church kept them alive for a long time. But eventually, this kind of stuff just sifted those other ones out. For most traditions, not all Christians, like the Ethiopian Orthodox and so forth, they do include the Shepherd of Hermas and whatever they use in their churches still. But eventually, most people started cutting them off to say. So, So back to does that help enough? Is it okay? A little bit? And we can talk more if you want to later on.
Okay.
The apocryphal acts, as I used them, was to demonstrate that the locations they mentioned were not corroborated. And as far as I understand, that's exactly right. That is, the locations I mentioned are the only locations they mentioned.
Okay, okay.
That's it. So they'll say Judea and Jerusalem, or whatever. That's the only location in the entire document. And so either they're very broad enough to be known by persons ever heard of Palestine, like Jerusalem's a town, or if they give a specific thing like the region of Nazareth. It was not a region, it's a town. In other words, if they get specific, they're wrong every time. So they either don't mention it, or it's very broad like Jerusalem, or if they're specific, they're wrong. Every time they mention the location. And beyond that, there's not much to corroborate that we can tell. Like there's dialogue, tons of dialogue, that Infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas, by a lot of scholars think it did this pretty early, but it's a sayings gospel. It doesn't include either any or very few locations at all, and it's just impossible to corroborate it because it's full of sayings. We don't have another source. Some things that Jesus says almost certainly come from particularly the Gospel of Matthew. I think it's Matthew. That's on the fly now. I remember now what it is. There's one gospel he prefers. But whenever it has something Jesus said, almost everyone says, yeah, and they got it from a gospel. So it's not an independent source. It'd be a tradition they received. There are sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, which is different from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. That's what the Muslims use.
Okay.
The Gospel of Thomas is different. That's what I'm talking about now. That's a sayings collection. It's almost only sayings. There's no miracles. It's just a sayings collection of wisdom. Almost certainly written by Gnostics down in Egypt. Is written in Coptic. And there are some sayings in that some New Testament scholars think Jesus really did say that are not in our Gospels. There are actually they're called agraphon, that's what we call in the Greek, that is not written. There are actual sayings of Jesus that didn't make it to our canon. There's a few that show up. So in PhD, for example, when we do, whenever you study the Gospel ever, if you do a paper on that, you have to cite the Gospel of Thomas just in case. So we read it, and if you can, from the Greek and so forth, because it's possible. So when you list a reference to something, you'll see this in scholarship a lot. If you say, I'm being hypothetical, if Jesus, one in particular I know because it's my paper on, say Jesus says in Luke 16, the man who built, he says, he gets a big fortune, he has a barn, he tears down this barn and builds a bigger barn. That night says, you fool, this night your soul's demanded of you. Now whose will they be? There's a very similar saying in the Gospel of Thomas, but it's a little different. And so some say that might be an independent form of that saying. There's no way to know for sure. But there are some sayings that we think maybe he did that might be an actual agraphon, a saying of Jesus. And that's not crazy to think about. Because it's not crazy to think there were sayings of Jesus that just didn't make it, because the gospel writers were either didn't have access to that oral tradition, or they deliberately limited it because it didn't fit the way they were trying to portray Jesus. The second reason what's not crazy is because we probably have evidence of floating sayings of Jesus that did not arise within a particular gospel, like the woman caught in adultery. So it shows up in Luke, it shows up in John. It probably was this independent floating saying of Jesus, and the gospel had already been written, like, where do we put it? Because we know he said it, but we're not sure if he said it, but early Christians apparently thought he did. So it's not crazy to think that. We just can't be sure. So the sayings are not corroborated. I mean, those locations and those apocryphal gospels are not located. And then very little else can be corroborated because most of it's sayings-based, or it's very specific to, say, Egypt. Or, I mean, they scream out local idiosyncratic text written by a local group of people who called themselves Christian, but they blended a bunch of local pagan ideas, like Gnostics did, or they just blended. Much like what people did in Jamaica when the Roman Catholics got there. They blended Roman Catholicism with their beliefs, and of course you get what? Voodoo. And so it's a blending of these different traditions, and that's what's happened all over. Well, in missionary work, happens all the time. Go to a Hindu and say, Jesus is the one way, the truth, and life. You go, oh, we love Jesus. We have many gods. Welcome. The water's just fine. Like, no. So that's always been the problem. And then they would write gospels or documents saying, we have one now too. And it became its foundational document. Bart Ehrman, who was a Christian, now is an atheist and goes around and makes a lot of money with his books, he'll go around, he's adamant about this, that there are all kinds of Christianities in the first several centuries, and we should never, ever shut them out because they're all equally valid. They're all just permutations of Christian faith. And to which always the other debate partner goes, well, hold on now, Bart. The church for centuries has said certain ones are more authoritative than the other. And he goes, no, 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 no. That's because they just wanted to get rid of them. It's a power struggle and all that. So whatevs. You can read them all you want. There's no one blocking you. They're probably at the library. They're all online, almost all of them. Not all of them have been translated, but not all the documents ever written. So back to your first question is, are there things in our Gospels that are not corroborated? The answer is absolutely. There's a lot of stuff not corroborated.
Or not even necessarily not corroborated, but are shown to be false.
Gotcha.
based
Well, you
on
asked two
sources.
things. One was, are there anything not corroborated? You said, are there some things shown to be false? So the first part, there are a lot of things not corroborated. Are the things shown to be false? As far as I know, no. As far as I know. There are some things that are still debated that scholars historically keep thinking they got wrong, but what keeps happening, I can't think of one example for where this is not true. Now, this is on the fly, but I've spent a lifetime in that scholarship. I can't think of anything. What tends to happen in scholarship is they go, oh, we found more corroboration. That is, I give tons of examples. A quick one comes to mind is the Gospel of John. When he talks about the pool of Siloam, the man comes by and he's been there all those years and stirred the water and all that stuff. For years, everyone said John's a little crazy. Most people, scholars, hated John. They thought he didn't know what he was talking about. It was written in the 2nd century. Most of it's just made up. And then they found a manuscript from the late 1st century. Well, how could we have a manuscript copy 100 years after it's supposedly written? So, that was hundreds of years of thousands of articles and books just worthless, because they found a manuscript that was earlier than all their arguments for it. Now it's earlier than they thought. And then in the story itself, you have like the Pool of Siloam, and they said, he made all that up, there's no way, until they found it. You can go there today, and it's exactly where they expect to find it in the story. The version, where he is in town and where he walks, it's exact. I've been there. And so that happened, I don't know, it was like 50 or 60 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. And so what happens is, really, most of the time since about 18th century, they're very critical and assume that he made that up. It was only for the church's edification. They wanted to glorify whatever their beliefs were, just like those Gnostics did, and just like everyone wanted to make up their own gospel. What just keeps happening is those scholars who were pessimistic, they're wrong. Every time we find something, it corroborates what we think. It might be a little nuanced. Maybe they thought that a town was smaller than they thought it was, or something like that. For a long time they thought Nazareth was made up until they found it. And so now there's a dig there. They do dig at Nazareth. Jesus' mythicists argue vehemently that Nazareth isn't Nazareth. It can't be, because Jesus would be from there, and we can't have that happen because he doesn't exist. But there's archaeological digs at Nazareth. So some things, it's not that everything is a one for one, but it's just over and over and over and over gets corroborated. There are times when the gospel will say the exact tetrarch or exactly which wife it is, and that wife only was that wife for like 8 months because the other ones were killed off. It's just, and they're exactly right. Or they'll call so-and-so a procreator versus a prefect, and there's exactly right. In that time period, that person was a procreator. But sometimes something's not right. You have, for example, the census in Luke chapter 2. This is, in that time, there was Caesar Augustus went out for a census for all the world to be enrolled. We don't have any other corroborating evidence that census happened then. There are inscriptions that demonstrate there were various censuses or censi taken years before, maybe during and years after. But that exact thing when Quirinius was governor, we don't have corroborating evidence. We do have corroborating evidence that a census was done in Quirinius about 10 years later. And so most New Testament scholars just say, Luke was just wrong. He's just 10 years off. Give the guy a break. This is what a lot of people say. They'll say, he wrote the gospel about 50 to 60 years after then. There is no Google. There's no records. He couldn't go to a person and say exactly what year. He just knew, it's about 50 or 60 years ago, about the time when Quirinius was governor. It's just that when you look now we can pinpoint it better. They say he's wrong. Others come back and say, no. Since we have evidence of censi or census before then, it's not unlikely that the census took years to complete, and that it was still going on the time of Quirinius. And that is not unreasonable either, because again, there's no email. When the census starts in Rome, it's got to go all over the Roman Empire. And we have some evidence that it could take decades from other censuses that we're taking, or censi, really? That's possible. We also have evidence, and then other people say, no, it's just silly, that's stupid to think that they would ask someone to go back to their ancestral home. And it might be, they maybe make that up. But we also have evidence in Egypt for that kind of census required, that in Egypt there was a census taken where you had to go back to your father's homeland. That doesn't mean it happened in Palestine. It just means that's not crazy historically. So there you have more like, what's the word, circumstantial evidence that seems to point the direction, but we do not have corroboration of that exact census when Quirinius was governor. You would have to fill in some gaps, if that makes sense. So those things like that do happen. But then still, though, it does not disconfirm it. It fits the first category, which is, are the things that happen that are not corroborated? Yes. Yeah.
But
We don't have
whenever we
corroboration.
But whenever something is found, it matches.
That's
the
right.
Scripture.
Everything I know about when it's found, that I know of any time it's ever found, it matches it just right. Every single time.
Yes.
That I know of. Now, you may find some nuances, but I know of no discovery or nothing. Go, oh my goodness, all this time. None. Both archaeologically speaking and, like I said before, and manuscripts. When we find older fragments, it fits what we'd expect. It always fits like a puzzle piece. There's never different versions. For example, the Shepherd of Hermas, that document I told you about, that came into the first century, it's kind of like a revelation, apocalyptic work. There's different versions of that, like different versions of the text, not like different words here and there, but almost like you'd have different versions of the Hobbit. They're different versions, and we have the manuscripts to prove there are different versions. We have nothing like that for anything in the New Testament. Nothing ever. So we find an earlier document. It's not like all of a sudden Jesus had 6 women as his disciples and he traveled in Egypt. And then he talked about the kingdom of God, a very different kind of storyline. It doesn't happen, ever. Ever. Same thing archaeologically speaking. If we find a bathhouse or a town or a village, it fits exactly what we already knew. It just enlightens more. We go, yeah. And some people joke, like, if you trusted John all along, you should have been digging there in the first place. But when you don't trust it, you don't go digging there. Not to mention Israel has barely just started. Archaeology, by the way, biblical archaeology is in its infancy. It's only been going on for maybe 50, 60 years. And the statistic I read lately was, it's something like 10 or 15% of Palestine has been dug. There's an enormous amount we just don't know because they won't allow us to dig. It's sacred spots. There's burial cemeteries everywhere. They won't let us get near it. There's a whole city underneath the city now that certain rabbis had found and dug up, but it was illegal to do so, but they went there anyway. There's a treasure trove. You talk about, what's his name? Indiana Jones. Really, there's so much we don't know. And with all complete fairness, when skeptics attack Christianity, or especially the Old Testament, which is real hard because it's very, very old. Not everything lasts in the sand. There's just so much we haven't uncovered. So the Old Testament has much more for which there is no corroboration than the New Testament. There was a lot more. Whole cities like Ai, that was very well known in the Judges period, or Ai, there's no record of Ai, or Ai, depending on how you want to say it. There's some evidence of Jericho, but it's a lot smaller than the text seems to talk about. There's all kinds of things that, but if I went to, say, Mormonism and say, David, you said there's no corroboration for their stuff. The difference there is we know exactly where we're supposed to look based on those documents, and we've dug there as far back as we could. There's a difference. It's like if the gospel said there's a town called Nazareth in between this town and that town by the Sea of Galilee, and no matter how much digging you do, there's no record of it ever. That would be a comparable. And that's not what happens in Christianity. It does in Mormonism. So we can go exactly where we should be expecting to find these bones of the carcasses and whatever, and you don't find any of them anywhere on any strata. Well, that's problematic. It's different like if we haven't dug there yet. Well, that'd be fair. We go, right, it hadn't been found yet. But they have. We have North American archaeologists been digging there for over 100 years, but that's not true in Israel. Every time we find anything, go, yep, that's what we thought to, yep, you're welcome. And of course, that doesn't mean every single word. We don't have that kind of record. There's no tape recorder.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom. or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways to reach out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.